The very vagueness of these ideals, which in many senses could be quite inclusive, because one didn't have to be Turkish to share in this identity of Ottomanism. It was not an ethnic identity, it was a loyalty to the state that was being accented here. The very vagueness of some of these ideals, however, made them unsatisfactory to some young Turks. And their ideology started to change in this regard, fatefully. Instead, ethnic nationalism came to be emphasized ever more. And the ethnic nationalism that was celebrated was that of a Turkish identity. The First World War would give a great boost to this development in a more ethnic nationalist and less inclusive direction, because now groups like the Armenians or other minorities of the Ottoman Empire did not have equal access to this celebrated overarching identity. When World War I broke out in 1914, Ottoman state officials, among them young Turks, feared that the Armenian Christian minority was in some sense an alien presence in their own midst. And in the scapegoating and the focus on this ethnic group itself, suspicions arose that the Armenian Christian minority might actually collaborate with the enemy. These suspicions were stirred by the fact that the Russians, just across the border, had Armenian minorities of their own who might engage in propaganda to lure Armenian minorities in the Ottoman Empire for the cause of achieving independence under Russian patronage, and thus it was ordered that measures should be taken against the Armenian minority. At the same time, some of the war aims of the Ottoman Empire, its goal, quite expansively and unrealistically as it turns out, to seek to achieve a pan-Turkish empire, even larger than the present extent of the Ottoman Empire, stretching into Central Asia and taking populations that currently were under the rule of the Russian Empire, once again accented an ethnic basis, an ethnic foundation for the identity of a future state, and this once again left the Armenians and other minorities isolated. The key figure in the measures that now were organized against the Armenian minority was Talat Pasha. Talat Pasha was the interior minister and a young Turk leader who directed the police forces of the Ottoman Empire, and who was instrumental and later quite candid about aspects of the planning and of the actions taken against the Armenians. In particular, these first plans dictated that threatened strategic areas were to be, we would today say, ethnically cleansed of minorities. These were areas that were particularly vulnerable, it was felt, to outside influence, and having populations that were considered, precisely because of their minority status, less loyal, perhaps, less reliable. These were areas that needed to be, in essence, remade ethnically through expulsions. And in particular, Greeks as well as Armenians, who were seen as notoriously unreliable, both of them, precisely because they had ethnic relations across the borders, were singled out. The strategy that was pursued was that of deportation. And indeed, deportation had a longer history in this region. The Ottomans earlier, as well as other Middle Eastern empires, had practiced the picking up and the removal of entire ethnic groups from one region and settling them down into another region as a strategy for how to deal with ethnic difference and ethnic minorities in past centuries. But this was taking place in a modern context, in the context of modern total war, and so these policies of deportation would turn into something different as planning and actions continued. At the same time, special security units were organized and established to enact these plans. These special security units were called the secret organization, the Teskilat-i Masusa. They were established to enact the plans that had been organized in advance. And now the massacres began. The killings opened with a preparatory stage that made clear that they were not entirely spontaneous, but indeed that preparations had been taken which now unfolded. Armenian soldiers who had served in the army of the Ottoman Empire had been previously and slowly, cautiously, reconfigured into units in which they were no longer in mixed ethnic military forces, but instead Armenian units themselves. And these then were disarmed, and the men in those units were killed. Then another wave of killing took place, and it started on April 25th, 1915. This first wave of arrests, followed by killings, coincided, and it's probably not a coincidence, with the Allied Gallipoli landing, which aimed to force the defeat of Ottoman Turkey in the war, the opening of the Dardanelles, and a strategic breakthrough that would yield final victory in the First World War. This Allied Gallipoli landings had taken place in April of 1915, and in some sense were creating at this very moment an urgent sense of crisis and of emergency, which the Young Turk leadership saw itself as responding to. The plans were also spurred on or accelerated by some armed resistance by Armenian communities and communal violence. In one case, when there actually was resistance towards the Turkish forces as they moved into an Armenian community, this was quelled with difficulty, but with immense violence. And this was pointed to afterwards in a sort of catch-22 as proof, allegedly, of the fact that Armenian communities had been planning a revolt or an uprising, even though, in fact, they'd been reacting to outside aggression. Indeed, at the same time, Russia had been, as an outside power, encouraging some of the Armenian rebels as part of the sort of program that all of the fighting powers were pursuing towards minorities in their enemies' populations, that policy of revolutionizing one's enemies' discontented groups that we've discussed in an earlier lecture. What was especially telling, however, was that the massacres that now followed were focused not only on communities in which resistance had taken place or which were suspected of disloyalty in particular. Rather, the massacres focused on the Armenian community as a whole. In particular, the first stages of this process saw an attempt to, we might say, decapitate the Armenian leadership of this ethnic community. Armenian intellectuals and community leaders who had a long established presence in the imperial capital of Constantinople, today Istanbul itself, were among the first targets. They were arrested, and also at the same time, such natural leadership groups in the provinces were arrested as well, and several hundred were immediately taken out and shot. After the arrests of the leadership, which might have coordinated an energetic response and which might have pleaded internationally for intervention, now events continued to unfold. Deportations began of larger Armenian communities, often announced on extremely short notice. People were simply told by proclamation that measures were being taken to ensure the safety of the Armenians, who it was claimed had shown their disloyalty but would be protected from the righteous wrath of the population at large by being moved away from the areas in which they had earlier lived. The men of these communities were often killed immediately, insofar as they hadn't actually been drafted before, moved into Armenian units, disarmed, and killed in the opening stages of this campaign. Women, children, and the old were now rounded up and were told to prepare for marches. These marches amounted to death marches, and there are stories or witness accounts of women begging to be shot on the spot rather than being launched on this long, agonizing trek towards death. Over the next 2 years, it's estimated that 2 to 3 million Armenians were deported from eastern Anatolia and other parts of the Ottoman Empire and marched, they were told, towards Syria, towards the Syrian desert. It was on occasion explained that they were simply being resettled there and that camps and settlements awaited them. No such preparations, in fact, existed. By some estimates, a third of the Armenians were massacred, A third perished en route in these marches, and a third survived. It's estimated that 500,000 to 1 million died, killed outright or from exposure in the desert. And these numbers are tremendously difficult to reconstruct accurately, and debate still rages about which numbers are most accurate. The numbers I've mentioned represent lower estimates. Some estimates run as high as 1.5 million dead.